Okay, and now on with, we're calling it a keynote, but we decided to do it interview style because we find that just more conversational and sort of, well, I personally really like to do it, so I put my vote in, and here we are having interview style. And our keynote guests are, as many of you know, Rob and Michelle Avis. They came all the way from Calgary and brought their children also, brought the whole family, so that they could be here with us today and also share with us their experience and their insights and their vision and knowledge based on the journey that they've had in building their company, Verge Permaculture, which is a very successful and influential permaculture company. And don't worry, we will explain permaculture. I know that that's a term that some of us know and some of us don't know, and some of us know just a little bit about. So we will get to that. But one thing that I found really interesting about Rob and Michelle is that they were not always permaculturists. They have a background as oil and gas engineers, somewhat surprisingly, because that's very different, am I right, from what you're doing now? Yeah. So tell us about that a little bit. Tell us about where you came from professionally in the past.
Okay. Okay? Yeah. So, Rob and I actually met here in Edmonton. We are both students at the University of Alberta taking our mechanical engineering degrees. And right after finishing my degree, I was right away scooped up and started working in the oil and gas industry, which I think probably 80% of engineering grads in this province end up doing. And loved it, to be honest. I was working for a big oil and gas company, making good money, found the work challenging and interesting. And Rob as well. Started working in the same industry with a consulting firm in Calgary. So.
Yeah. Also found it really challenging. But one of the things that we started coming up against was this idea that we were somehow perpetuating status quo, and I felt really hypocritical almost, criticizing the very industry that I was working for, and also purchasing the product that I was bringing to market. And I didn't see very many solutions. I saw a lot of problems, I didn't see many solutions. So we started to get a little disenfranchised with what we were doing.
And Rob, I believe you also had some background in the industrial food field, is that right?
Yeah, so my dad, some of you might know the company, Saxby Foods. I grew up, I'm Charlie in the chocolate factory. I grew up in a company, literally, that would put out 20 to 80,000 cheesecakes in a day. Unfortunately, the company...
Putting cherries on the cake.
Yeah.
As they go by.
So it's kind of funny how you're...
Seriously.
Yeah. Your past kind of inform where your future goes. So now I talk about decentralized energy and local food, but I came from industrial food and industrial energy.
So you really do know the flip side of the equation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you talked about this a little bit, but at some point, like how long did you do that before things started to, sort of the lack of fit started to be clear?
So I was in the oil industry for about 5 years, and then I grew up in the food industry my whole life. But to be honest with you, I remember as a child going to the Vancouver Zoo and seeing the rainforest getting cut down, and I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister that very afternoon. So I've always wanted to do something different, but didn't really have the context to be able to understand what that was.
So you're in this sort of dark place, and you know that there's a lot of, is cognitive dissonance too jargony a thing? Like where what you know and what you see like doesn't jive and it doesn't feel right, and but then something started to emerge. You started to get an idea of what it was that you would like to do, the change that you would like to see. Can you tell us about how that beginning of a transformation sort of started to happen?
Do you want me to?
I think I'm just going to throw in there something, despite enjoying the work and finding it really interesting and challenging and secure, I remember working with folks who were near retirement and had been working for this company for 30, 35 years, nearing retirement, and they had basically given their whole life to this cause. And I remember thinking I didn't want to be there. I didn't feel it was interesting at the time, and it was great making good money, but it definitely wasn't passionate about it, and I was starting to realize how time was so valuable. You only have you only have one lifetime, and you really want to make sure you're contributing in the things that you're most passionate about. So these kind of things were starting to surface, and Rob especially.
Yeah, I mean, the dark place thing, I was in a really dark place, and I think I really felt the weight of my sentiment on my family. I'd learned about peak oil and deforestation and all of these environmental issues, and all I could ever see around me were problems. There were no solutions, and I really loved the talk this morning because I really resonated with that idea of story. And so as we were going through our careers as engineers, the same story just kept coming up over and over again, which is that renewable energy is not possible. We can't feed the world using different methodologies. We can't build different houses, and there were just all these blockades, and it was getting really disempowering. And so we eventually just left our jobs to seek those solutions.
So you realized that you weren't going to be able to shift that without a major life transformation.
Well, I remember this exact project that I was working on. I was putting in a facility in northern Alberta, designing it and putting it in place. And I wanted to do something really, well, actually, it's not even that innovative. It was innovative for the company that I was working for, a really small thermodynamic thing. And I fought for it as hard as I could. Like, oh man, look at how much energy we could save if we just did this. And what I realized was that there was just no incentive for them to do that. And so I could potentially spend the next 30 years of my life trying to change the course of this behemoth, and I didn't even know whether that was the course that I was or wasn't going to take. But the real issue was that I didn't see any solutions. And so it was the traveling that we did where we were actually seeking how other cultures deal with similar problems. That was so enlightening, and that's when the weight got lifted off of my shoulders and we were able to fly.
Now, I've heard you say, on camera actually, in a video of yours that I watched, that we can't rely on corporations and governments to change the world. They're not going to do it for us. It's our job, and we each have to take it on. Can you expand on that idea a little bit? I think it's really interesting.
Can we take that?
I'll add it.
Okay. So, yeah, I think that just to kind of round that question out a little bit, it's not us versus the corporations or government. I don't want to convey that message at all. I think that the problems that we face are so hyper complex that the people that are kind of behind the controls they're doing the best they can, mostly so. And I think what became really apparent to me was that we live within this linear system where we've got industries that extract, we've got industries that manufacture, we've got industries that wrap, we've got industries that landfill, and we sit in the middle as consumers. And one of these myths or these stories that we continually tell ourselves is that we're unable to actually facilitate change as one person. And as we started traveling around, we started meeting all of these visionaries who were one person, who were making massive change around them. And so the corporations and the governments are doing the best they can to steer this broken ship that we're on. But ultimately, is the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail? And so our mission has really been to, as engineers, quantify how much change one person can actually have. And when I say quantify, I mean I have Excel spreadsheets and I do the calculations and I figure out what does it mean to create that kind of impact? And so I have a list of all the things that we can do around that. So yeah.
And you'll email that out after the...
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think that I don't think there's ever been an instance where, from the government perspective, government has made policy ahead of popular public opinion. And that's where it's really important that you have public opinion really strong and communicated to government before they can make policies. We can't sit and wait for them to make the policies we need. So it is very much...
and I suppose that would be similar of corporations too. They have customer bases and employee groups and and shareholders, and they aren't going to make decisions without those people.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's probably a whole other interview. Okay, so would you share with us in the journey that you've taken from that dark place where you were to where you are now, can you share some of the ups and downs, like some of the real highs and lows of that?
I'd say one of the, let's start with the highs or the lows. One of the best things, 5 years into it now, is the freedom of time. The thing that I value the most out of everything is how, having our own business allows us to design our own schedule, and our kids are 1 and 3, so we really do design our work schedule around spending as much time as possible with our kids and being there for them, and I just can't put a monetary value on that, and both of us being there for them. So that's an up of kind of running our own business and doing this kind of work specifically related to our family life. But then another up is just seeing some of our students and some of the great projects they're doing. And that's
like Steve, who
highlight.
gave you a shout out earlier?
Yeah, and there's so many. I don't know.
Mike Dorian, he's here.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, anything you want to add for ups or downs?
Yeah, I mean, I remember coming back from one of our travels. We were crossing over the Alberta-BC border, and I looked to Michelle and I said, "What the heck are we doing in Alberta? We should be in BC. Like, this province is not ready for what we want to bring here." And totally dumbfounded by the number of in-the-closet greenies that just kind of come out of the woodwork and have, I feel like I'm crowd surfing some days by the number of people that want this information and want this formative change. And I guess the down or the hard parts about putting your neck out there and standing up and actually saying some controversial things once in a while is the criticisms. We've had some amazing staff working for us who've kind of filtered that out, and recently some stuff came in, and it can be challenging sometimes to receive criticism from people, but as they say in Australia, it's a little bit of the tall poppy syndrome, and you kind of just have to soldier through it. So that'd be the challenging things.
So speaking of, you said that your students in the I love that crowd surfing quote, by the way. I feel like I'm crowd surfing some days. That would be true of look at all these people that we're crowd surfing on. It's wonderful. But through that, we know that you have really helped to foster and build the permaculture community in, I would say, not only Calgary there, but Alberta. I know several people here in Edmonton and probably all across the province that have taken your courses and that have really taken inspiration from that. Was that part of your plan? Was that intentional, like something you did on purpose, or just kind of happened?
Yeah, I have had some amazing mentorship in the last 10 years, and one of the things that I set out to do right away was to ensure that I could mulch myself. So mulch is kind of, when we manage an ecosystem, the mulch is the detritus that comes off from that year, and it builds the soil underneath. And eventually, if you mulch yourself enough, you create the foundation for the next layer to emerge. And one of the biggest risks teaching is very difficult. It takes a lot of energy. And you can never, as an individual, know that you're going to be on the same path. In fact, the only thing you can say for certain is you probably will not be on the same path for your whole life. The 30-year job just doesn't happen anymore, very rarely anyways. So really believing in what I do and knowing that someday, maybe it's 30 years down the road, but maybe it's 10 years down the road, I probably wouldn't be on the same path that I am right now, really working to build the next layer of succession, if you will, by creating a couple of interesting strategies around us. And so we actually do the exact opposite of what corporate America would say is a good idea. We encourage our students to teach. We encourage our students to start additional businesses. And probably the biggest, coming back to the students, high that I've had as of recent is creating this ecosystem of businesses, specifically down in Calgary, but that's happening up here too. And seeing the relationships and the connections form between symbiotic companies that are working towards the same end. And so it's like we're in this big, huge, what are those, portaging canoes, the ones that go down the North Saskatchewan? And we're starting to feel those pulses now as we row together as a group of individuals. And so now it's not us in the middle anymore. We're kind of moving into the background, and they're taking the stage.
Michelle, did you, 5 years ago, would you have known that you were going to spawn all these other, or help to sort of create this generative model where others take it forward?
Well, one of our mentors when we went to Australia is Jeff Lawton, whom some of you might know and some of you might not. But I remember him saying that one of the things, he's near retirement, he said one of the things he was most proud of was having started this community group in his community and kind of seeing that live beyond him and be able to step down from the exec and see the kind of good work that community group was going to continue to do. And so when we got back to Calgary, we just kind of thought, well, let's just start there. We really admire him and think that that's probably really sage advice. So alongside with starting our business in permaculture, we actually started a permaculture community group at the same time. So, and it was great. And it took a couple years. It was sluggish at first, but it's great. We're not even on the executive anymore. And they're organizing monthly potlucks and plant exchanges and seed swaps and talks where they get together and talk about rainwater harvesting and sustainability and backyard chickens. And so this it lives on beyond us, and that's been great.
Would you have a couple of do's and don'ts for folks that are kind of where you were 5 years ago and who want to be generative leaders? Like what are some, maybe just some quick tips of what works?
Ask lots of questions and talk to as many different people running businesses as you possibly can. And just because maybe they run a drilling company, maybe there's a lot of oil and gas that we're surrounded by. Don't demonize anybody in any industry. Everybody has their own brilliance, and after 5 years of running a business, there are certain things that you do in business that just make sense, and it's worth asking those types of questions. So, we consulted with Tad. Tad's not here today, but Tad was an angel for us. We're engineers, we're not communicators, typically. And so Tad really helped to craft what it is that we do so that people could actually latch onto it or understand at least what we do.
That's Tad Hargrave, the co-founder of the Good100, by the way. We are videotaping this for posterity, so I want to make sure that we're really clear.
And I want to say, don't be scared to not only ask for advice, but pay for advice. The best advice we've gotten is actually advice that we've paid for. And not necessarily even that we've paid a lot for it, but there's something about if you approach somebody that you really admire and they've done a good job doing what they've done, either a lawyer or an accountant, or an offer to say, I value your time, I value the information you're gonna potentially give me. Would you sit down with me for an hour? Can I hire you? You'll get far more valuable advice and attention than you would just trying to collect advice for free. And you can get a ton of advice for free, but maybe help that guide where you need specific help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good advice.
And so we did actually. We brought in experts. We brought in people that we thought could help us with their business. So that's advice kind of from the starting a business side of things.
Yeah, but probably for anything you're trying to do, it's good to get good mentors and
mentors and good advice.
Good advice. I just want to pause a second here to let everybody know we're going to talk for about 10-15 more minutes, and then we're going to have question and answers. So start to think about if you have questions for Rob and Michelle, what they might be, and then we will move into that in a few minutes. But now, I promised we would explain what permaculture is. So what is permaculture anyway?
Permaculture is a design approach for solving the question, how do we meet our needs while preserving ecosystem health? And in fact, it challenges us to ask the question, how do we meet our needs while enhancing ecosystem health? Permaculture is notoriously difficult to define, and if you've ever asked anybody for a definition, you've probably heard, a different one from every single person. And I think the reason for that is because we're currently in this paradigm, this culture, and this context, where the question we ask is, how do we meet our needs? And we stop there. How do we meet our needs? And we have all these ways to meet our needs. This is how we build a house like this, and we set up our municipal landfills like this, and we turn our taps on and we get water like this. but we don't ask the right question. So we need a new paradigm. We need a new paradigm, which is how do we meet our needs while preserving or enhancing ecosystem health? And only once you are asking that question and you have that paradigm, that's when permaculture is relevant, because it's a design approach that helps you to solve that question. Okay?
Is permaculture, I know that a lot of the time people that understand a little bit of permaculture associate it always with the physical environment, gardening, wastewater collection, that kind of thing. Does it go broader than that?
Yeah, so permaculture is foundationally based on how ecosystems function. So it's built out of a series of principles that provide tools within a toolbox on how to design anything. So most people think, it's just how to grow food, but actually they couldn't be further from the truth. We designed our business around permaculture systems. So the mulch analogy that I gave you, that's how an ecosystem functions. An ecosystem returns nutrient back to the soil. Our business is fundamentally built around how an ecosystem functions. You could say that we're building a forest or a community of enterprises around us, or that we're just one of, I should say. But it also helps you to design community groups. So we use permaculture in the way that the permaculture community group is built to create political strategies as well, to try and encourage our local politicians to actually pay attention to what we're doing. So absolutely, it's very broad in its approach.
It's a framework, it's a strategy, it's a toolkit.
So permaculture has a design framework that can be applied to virtually anything then? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the most amazing part about it. So these principles that govern, I should say that ecosystems all function under a specific set of principles that we've been able to identify. Specifically, ecologists have identified these principles. And principles are universal in time and place. And so because we are fundamentally part of this planet, we can understand how ecosystems have been solving problems for the last 4 billion years, and we can apply those problem-solving mechanisms to the way that we solve all of the problems, both in our physically, socially, politically. It doesn't really matter. And I guess the framework that Nadine's kind of hinting at here is that we tend to try and solve problems that are absolutely astronomical, and then we end up burning out. That's the typical pattern. What permaculture does is understands that the fundamental strength lies in the masses, not in the few. And problems can be defined, the problems that we're surrounded by can be defined into things that move quickly and things that move slowly. And the slow moving things are the ones that we're all paying attention to. Peak oil is an example. I can't personally create a huge amount of change around the peak oil topic, but I can do a lot of small things that's very empowering, that actually, when you add up the aggregate of all the individual things that we can do, will move mountains. And so it's about focusing on the right place. Can you give it, I'm just curious to hear what a specific example of one of those small things that would add up would be.
Okay, so
in the case of peak oil.
Yeah, there was a great article in Harper's called The Oil We Eat, and Richard Manning details out how every calorie of food we consume requires 10 calories of hydrocarbon. Most people will read that article and be like, oh, we're doomed. Let's go to Safeway and get some rotisserie chicken and forget about it. But permaculture, one of the foundational principles is that every problem is a solution. So you don't have a grasshopper problem, you have a turkey deficiency. And so when I look at that statistic, we have to understand our inherent limitations, specifically in the prefrontal cortex. And you hear something negative, it instantly shuts off the thinking part of your brain. And so we can take that 10 calories of hydrocarbon for 1 calorie of food, and we can say, well, that means that for every calorie of food I grow in my backyard, I'm supplanting 10 calories of hydrocarbon. Bam. And not only that, but so we talk about 3% GDP growth, right? And how are we ever going to turn this around into a zero growth or a net neutral growth economy when we've got these monolith corporations and governments around us? Well, we all spend about 10 to 15% of our annual budget on food. So we only have to change a very small, like the reason permaculture gets categorized into the gardening thing is that gardening is kind of the gateway drug towards sustainability. And if you just hit people in the stomach, everything shifts. Everything shifts.
Later on, I'll have to get you to tell me what opportunity the cats that think my sheet mulch are a litter box represents.
Nutrient.
Okay. Anyway, so I've heard you say that that we don't really have good things and bad things. Is that what you mean? Like every problem, like there is nothing that is inherently good or bad?
Yeah. So I have nothing against the oil sands. I have nothing against industrial fertilizer. I have nothing against Roundup. That's super controversial for me to say. I just see them as tools. The thing is that if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, then every problem is a nail. And so what permaculture does is it gives us a framework and additional tools to look at the world in a much broader context. And I'll give you an example of that. When we take a rainforest down, horrible thing to do. In a rainforest ecology, specifically in the Amazon, all the nutrients stored in the trees. None of the nutrient gets stored in the soil because there's so much rain there. If it was, it would just get washed out. So the ecosystem has evolved to store that nutrient in its canopy. To get that rainforest back up again, because there's no nutrient left in the soil, you have to use commercial fertilizer. So it's more about the appropriate use of elements as opposed to this element's good or this element's bad. And how do we frame that within the larger context of the ecosystem health and meeting our needs at the same time?
And how do these principles relate to the broader work of social change? Like we have people in this room that are working on everything from soup to nuts, right? And so how would these ideas serve them?
Well, so back to the question we asked, how do we meet our needs? And I think we could pretty easily identify how pretty much everything that people are working on fit either an individual need or a cultural need or a social need, right? So the framework, like there's no question that the principles in the framework can be applied to all of those needs. We're not talking about some needs and not others. As for a specific example?
Well, I mean, this event is kind of like a mycelial network. And you've...
mushrooms?
Yeah, the root systems that connect everything within the forest. And so when gatherings like this occur, we could say, what's the principle? I mean, basically, ecosystems are fundamentally built on connection. And I would say another thing that happens, especially in Alberta, there's so much volunteerism and activism that happens here, but there aren't enough of these types of events to actually create cross-pollination and understand what we're doing. And so that's fundamentally, if you look at how a forest is built, it's not the individual layers in the forest that matter, but it's the connections between the elements that really change the dynamic of the forest. So organizing socially around how forest ecologies are fundamentally constructed would be an example of how we could take a permaculture principle and move it out into the social sphere.
Can you be, my sister went to your course a couple of years ago, and it blew her mind, and she was, all on fire about it. And I was a little intimidated by that because I thought, oh, this is a whole, there's a whole theory to it, and it's really complicated and involved and in-depth. But then I realized the things she started to do as a result were all things I already did, like canning and meeting my neighbors and gardening and, wanting to drive less, like that kind of stuff. So it makes me wonder, can you be kind of a permaculturist without knowing about it?
I want to go back to that worldview where I think there's two worldviews. There's the people who ask the question, how do I meet my needs? And then there's the people who ask the question, how do I meet the needs while preserving or enhancing ecosystem health?
So you could already have that worldview.
So you could already have that worldview, there's no question. And what permaculture does, if you have that worldview, gives you the tools to be able to solve that question, right? So yes and no. You can definitely have that worldview. We're not saying that, and I mean, sometimes
this isn't a completely new thing, right?
No, and there's environmental groups, and there's tons of other really exciting I'm going to call them movements and philosophies and things happening around the world where people are starting to say, we need to embrace this, like wake up people. Like our health is so intricably tied to ecosystem health. We have to start thinking this way. So that's the world, that's the paradigm shift that's happening, but needs to happen much more.
So with that, I think we will shift to questions. Antoine has the other mic, and if you just put your hand up if you have a question for Rob or Michelle.
How do you look so pretty, Antoine? You look very pretty today. That's my question. I just love what you said, Rob, around the mulching yourself. We permaculture in our houses on the Eco Solar Home Tour. But I loved how you applied that to yourself. It's just people don't really apply mulching themselves. And given that you have a paradigm of continual growth, I know you're in transition in some way, right? What are you busy mulching now? You're discovering that the latest context is kind of used up, got you where you got to, and it's in between you and the next size of difference you want to make. What are you busy dismantling where you are so that something new can grow? And I know it's not easy, you can't see the thing from within the current paradigm, you can't see the new paradigm. I'm just wondering if you have a glimpse of it and what you're doing to mulch yourself.
So, there's kind of two parts to that question, two parts to the answer, I should say. I started mulching myself right from the beginning. So we have new teachers who are coming in and teaching permaculture around us right now. So I know that I could walk away from Calgary and the idea would continue on. I know that, in fact, I'm not teaching in Edmonton this year because there are people in Edmonton that are now starting to really take a leadership role. Arina is one of them here, and so is Steve. And so knowing where the system has had enough what's the word? Cultivating, let's say that, and knowing when to step back and let the system show its own evolutions. So, and then in my own system back in Calgary, what I'm doing is I'm teaching less. So we hosted a huge number of courses just a couple of years ago, and we're starting to back off a little bit more on the teaching. Number one, first and foremost, to make more time for my family. But number two, to open space up to see where we can go. And then the second part of the question is that we're engineers. And I think one of the pieces of advice that I can give to people is that we all have muscles. And some of our muscles are further developed than others. And we ran away from engineering as quickly as we could, or at least I'll speak for myself, because I felt that I wasn't contributing to the solution. And now looking back on the last 5 years, I recognize that that's actually a really strong muscle that I've got. And I can walk into a room, I don't ever have to explain what an engineer does. But when I walk in and say, I do permaculture, it's like, oh. And so we're really looking to see how we can leverage that muscle to be able to walk in. And I guess what I'll say is that permaculture tries to get from A to Z. So if the new paradigm is Z, we're trying to move everybody to A to Z. I think that what we all, as a group of people, have to do is figure what's A to B? And how do we get people just to move one step? And so as an engineer, I can walk into the room and not threaten anybody because I have a degree and I don't wear a ring, but if I did, people would be able to see that that's what I do. And I can do this other stuff under the context of this thing that's not threatening. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's where we're going.
Hannah, over here, unless there's somebody else over there.
I have a question regarding mentorship. That's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, and I was wondering, when you're looking for mentors, there's some obviously that are very clear in terms of folks you've sought out in different parts of the world, but what do you, having various mentors, one, what do you look for in a mentor, or what's the most helpful thing a mentor can provide? And two, just curious, who's the most surprising mentor you've had?
Yeah. So I have sought out a couple mentors. Jeff Lawton was one of them, and there's a few others in Australia as well, and in Denmark. So those were kind of calculated moves, I guess. Calculated is the wrong word, but we planned them, I guess. And sometimes you just, this is going to sound really weird and woo-woo and out there, but sometimes you just have to put it out to the universe and see what comes back. You know, like, one thing I think we also don't do very well as a sustainability movement, if I could call it that, is ask for help. And so I had an amazingly brilliant person take one of my courses last year, and I was looking specifically for some coaching, and he just kind of appeared and was like, wow, what is this type of person doing in my class? And what does he find interesting about permaculture? And he took me out for lunch, and it's been amazing. So I think it's about setting goals, partially. It's like, if you see somebody, go ask them. If you don't see somebody, then just set that intention and something will magically happen. It's not great advice, but it works.
Oh, Deborah?
Hi guys. So I think one of the biggest challenges to creating change is the resistance that we meet from other people who don't share our vision. And I imagine that you guys have had many opportunities to engage in conversations with people who are just not on the same page as you, who are working from a different paradigm. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, how can you reach a constructive dialogue? How can you get to a point where you can break down some of those barriers and actually begin to have a constructive conversation with someone who doesn't share your paradigm?
I'm going to admit that probably in the last 5 years, one thing we had to concede on is that we were going to really focus on the people who already had that paradigm but didn't have the tools. We were very intimidated by the idea of changing people's paradigm. So we don't have a lot of experience necessarily trying to change people's paradigm. That wasn't the realm that we wanted to necessarily work in and put our energy towards. Having said that, something that I've come across recently that I'm really excited about is holistic management and holistic goal setting. And we don't have time to get really into it, but I'm so excited about the possibility it provides for getting people to reframe that question back to that, how do we meet our needs versus how do we meet our needs and preserve ecosystem health. And it's about it's about sitting people down and getting them to set their personal goals and helping them go through their own goal setting process that ultimately helps them understand that we are tied to our ecosystems. And in fact, you don't do anything other than guide people through that own process, and it becomes a very self-directed, epiphany, so it's called Holistic Management, and it's the the Savory Institute. There's a great TED Talk by Alan Savory if you're interested in these kind of ideas. I'm super excited about that.
One of the things that I was doing in the oil and gas industry is I was moonlighting as a renewable energy engineer, doing some pretty big projects actually. And I got very disenfranchised with this having to be a salesperson and having to go and pitch ideas to people. When they were like, and this was 8 to 10 years ago now, and when people were just not interested in it. And so I got so disenfranchised with it that I promised that I would never pitch or try and convince anything to anybody. And that sounds like I just gave up, but actually I didn't at all, because there's a guy in the States, I can't remember his name right now, but he's really big behind the anti-GMO movement. And he said there's enough people that already buy into the GMO argument, like that don't want GMOs. And all we have to do is just get them to speak up. And so I would say there's more than enough people that want to make this change. But as Tad would say, that if the communication isn't right, then what you're trying to do ostensibly doesn't exist. So this comes back down to the design process and system, is that where do you have the power to create small changes around you? And my mother-in-law said this to me when I got back from traveling. She said, you'll overestimate what you do in 1 and you'll underestimate what you do in 5 years. So not getting discouraged by the small changes, because when you add them up, they create massive, massive shifts. And then you don't burn out. So I'm not yelling at people because they're not doing something in a specific way. They're just living their life based on the context that they know. The people that are ready to make the shift, they will find you, and you can help them along their path, and they will help other people.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
I really wanted to thank you guys. This has been very inspiring. And one of the things that you've really inspired me with is this idea that you're actually talking about something that also is a groundswell movement, which is towards oneness. People talk about oneness, we talk about mindfulness, and then we start talking about big pharma, or we start talking about GMOs, or we start talking about the oil industry, and suddenly we become totally duality-based again. So it's really fascinating and wonderful to hear you say that sometimes you need a Band-Aid, and that's not contributing to big pharma, that's using your common sense. So I love that you're expressing that it actually is all good, depending on whose hands those tools are in. So again, what I heard you say that I thought was really cool, a total oneness statement is everything becomes mulch. And the mulch will turn around and become a tool for growth, no matter what the topic is. So my question for you simply is, do you see a difference in this sense of the tools being treasures in the right hands? Because that's what you're saying, you got tired of preaching and suddenly started realizing you didn't need to preach anymore. Everybody's starting to recognize the treasure of the tools. So how do you see connecting the hands with the tools in the future? Because that's kind of what you're getting at, as far as what I got, was there's these tools. The best way to improve is to understand the right hands, connecting with the tools, using them to create an amazing preserved ecosystem. So how do you see us sending that information out more?
So Vic was asking, what's my next move and what am I dismantling? And one of the reasons that I'm teaching less and trying to look back inwards to see where I can have more impact is recognizing that my most powerful, my most important students are my children. And if I'm giving more attention to the people around me than I am to them, I'm doing the whole world a disservice. And Nadine said, can you be a permaculturist and not know it? I actually think it's totally ridiculous that I have to make a living teaching people how to use gray water and grow lettuce and harvest rainwater and build low energy buildings. I think it's ludicrous that we've gotten to this place where we have to have experts that tell us this. Because maybe low energy buildings is kind of a new technology and a new development. I'll put that one aside. But the growing food and preserving food thing, we had this in our culture 100 years ago. And so part of mulching myself is knowing that if we do our job right, we will empower mothers and fathers to bring these ideas back into how we just live. And I won't be needed anymore. And it's not going to be a permaculture toolbox. It's just going to be culture, and it's just going to be weaved into to what's the right way to live, so that we can enhance our ecosystems while living technologically advanced, fruitful, comfortable lives. We don't have to ride horse and cart to be sustainable.
And live in yurts? I thought.
No.
I thought we were going to live in yurts.
No, don't have to live in yurts either.
Oh, okay. That's good. I like my house. Before I interrupt, did you have anything to add, Michelle?
No.
Okay. Is there another question immediately? I have one if nobody else. Okay.
I have a question.
Okay. Antoine, go ahead.
So you have people who come to permaculture, they may be already gardening or somehow passionate about ecosystem health and equilibrium and balanced life. Have you seen, in the work that you've done, have you seen people who come new to this paradigm? My question is, like, what are the incentives? What motivates them to like plug into this new sphere of thinking? And do you see incentives in some of the direction that you're going in terms of larger scale applications, working with companies, working with industry, working with governments, municipal, provincial? Why would people want to explore a new paradigm along these lines?
Okay, I think I'm going to talk about on a personal level, and then I'll leave you to talk about some of the interesting things we've discovered on the municipal level. I think we've done a good job in our society of hiding feedback loops. And because we've had so much land, particularly in Canada, where you can buy something at the supermarket where 50% of it goes into the garbage, the packaging. You can eat it and that's it. The garbage truck comes and picks it up and takes it away, and there's no feedback. You don't ever see or think about where that garbage goes, just as an example. And I think what's happening is we're starting to see tighter and tighter feedback loops. We're starting to hit limits, ecological and environmental limits, where suddenly we're realizing that, oh, wait a second, we can't do these things without thinking about the broader implications, environmental and ecological implications, because they are coming back to hurt us. And so that can definitely be one motivator or one epiphany that people often have. They actually realize it is a loop, and that we're not in a linear system of extraction to disposal. Our Earth works in cycles. And that's one of the principles of permaculture, is create feedback loops. And so one thing that you would do using this framework is you would say, okay, let's design a kitchen waste water system that feeds your garden. And someone always, when we mention that, says, oh, but what about the toxic soaps that you use? You wouldn't want to put that in your garden. And the response is, well, why would you put that in the sink anyways? That it goes out somewhere. It's just by creating a tighter feedback loop, we design it so that people are more conscious about their actions and the implications of their actions on their immediate environment. So that's kind of an example of maybe how people come to it, and how through design, we design systems that get people more conscious about how we can meet our needs, which is getting water, while preserving or enhancing ecosystem health. So tighter feedback loops is just one principle of it's in the permaculture toolbox. So
I think self-preservation too. I mean, we get a lot of people who come to us and they're absolutely terrified that the world is going to come to an end, the financial system's going to unravel, and they've got it all mapped out when it's going to happen. And
bug out locations.
It's like, and we just get these like.
Not everybody.
Not everybody, but a lot of people come at this from a state of fear, and they latch on to permaculture as a way to self-preserve themselves, which is great, I guess. And then by the time I've sat down with them for 72 hours, they come out with hopefully a different perspective on the world, and that we probably can sort these issues out. So there's that. On the industrial and on the municipal side, I've been interviewing towns in the US, Alberta, and British Columbia for a few months now. And why would they do it? Because it's economic. And I'll give you a great example of it. In Portland, they have a commingled storm sewer system. So when they have big rain events, this was 30 years ago, they'd have massive discharges of raw sewage into the river. And the US government said, we can't do this anymore, you've got to change it. And so they went out and they had engineers come in and say, how are we going to deal with this commingled sewer system? I think Edmonton has the same issue, actually. Most cities are designed this way. And they came back and said, this is a $1.5 billion problem to make all the pipes bigger so that we can manage the fact that we defecate into drinking water, which is totally insane. Sorry, I just had to put that in there. And so then they said, well, what if we look at a totally different way of solving this problem? And so they looked at dealing with stormwater on a point source basis. Basically dealing with it where it falls. So we've created these huge cities that are impervious with all the concrete and pavement, which we all look at as a really bad thing. But if you look at it from a tree's perspective, if you can turn those roads into roofs, you can actually grow very luscious things that would normally not grow here because we have access to a water resource that's not typically available. So we're actually concentrating the awesomeness of the ecosystem with these roads. And so what Portland did is they created rain gardens and infiltration systems all over the city. So now this urban drool, which was causing a problem, became an urban opportunity. And what's really cool, when I was talking to the planner in Portland, they said if they hadn't have done that, the $1.5 billion liability that they had then would have to be readdressed right now because the city has grown so much. So this new development paradigm that they approached, which is exactly what we do in permaculture, allowed them to continue to grow their city without having to perpetually increase their infrastructure. And they actually took the $1.5 billion liability, they saved money, and they created the right context for people to make change. So they actually paid people to change their landscapes so that they could save money on the infrastructure. So they incentivized them, they created a greener city, and now everybody wants to live in that town.
Yeah, and it's a beautifully lush green city because all these nature strips are now growing trees and they're mulched basins, and they're trying to harvest water and put that, what was a waste, into productive use.
Isn't it nice when it's all win-win like that?
Yeah.
Okay, and with that, I think we will wrap up our keynote. I am very grateful to the two of you, Rob and Michelle Avis of Verge Permaculture, for being here with us today and for being here all weekend and contributing your awesomeness.